English language learning podcast. Our episode today is not unpopular opinion. Our episode today comes from news headlines, where I will read to you a news headline. You can practice your listening, your comprehension, but the topic is not goofy or silly. The topic is usually more serious. Today it's inflation. So let's get started with the headline title. You can write it down for dictation and listening practice. You can try and type it in your computer, or you can just listen. So, from AP.com, apnews.com by Stan Cho, Choe, and this is from last year, November 17th, 2022. So this is old. We'll give an inflation update at the end of the episode because I'm doing this episode on February 16th, 2023, just after the Super Bowl. Headline: Trimming the fat. Inflation finally hitting profit margins. Trimming the fat. Inflation finally hitting profit margins. Trimming the fat. Inflation finally hitting profit margins. Pause. If you have some difficulty listening to English when people are speaking, like I am right now, when you're practicing, if you are more basic level, just try and follow the general story or commentary. Don't worry. Don't have big preoccupations about understanding every single word. It's too much. If you're more intermediate or advanced, try and listen to how spoken English is different than written English. So you may need to find the website, the article. You can find the link in the info section on the YouTube channel. But listen to elements of spoken English that are different. For example, pronouns, me, them, him, her, articles, the, a, prepositions, in, of, for, to. So again, the headline: Trimming the fat. Inflation finally hitting profit margins. One more time. Trimming the fat. Inflation finally hitting profit margins. Okay, let's jump in to the, 4 paragraphs that we will read from this article. It's much longer. We only read the beginning. So here we go. From New York. Corporate profits have withstood raging inflation over much of the last year, but those good times may be ending. Profits stayed fat even as companies' costs rose thanks to one simple trick. Businesses boosted the prices they charged customers by more than their own costs rose. Now, though, more companies are seeing their costs rise faster than their revenues. In the parlance of finance executives, their margins are getting squeezed, and that's acting as a drag on their profits. To be sure, corporate profits are still near record highs. Companies in the S&P 500 are in the midst of reporting overall growth of roughly 2% for summer from a year earlier. Many companies also say they still have the power to hold the line on prices for their products, if not raise them further. But some of the signs of stress are beginning to show, and analysts say even faster margin declines may be on the way given how fragile the economy is. And I believe that is all we will read. That is the end. In our next segment, we'll break down some of those vocab words. Hopefully, I can anticipate all of the most difficult elements or vocab from that short reading from a bigger article. So Stay tuned in the next segment. Vocab, grammar, all things English. Vocab, grammar, spoken English, pronunciation. So let's get started. Let me read the headline one more time just to make sure everyone is in the same place. All of you trimming the fat, inflation finally hitting profit margins. So, from the headline, trimming the fat. So, the infinitive of this expression is to trim, T-R-I-M, the fat, a gordura. In business, to cut or slice off pieces that are more or less unnecessary to maintain your numbers or your targets or get closer to your numbers or targets. So to trim the fat would be to eliminate things that are costing you. What would that be? Cortar gordura. Let me check this one. To trim the fat. Cortar gordura. To withstand something. To withstand. W-I-T-H-S-T-A-N-D. One word. It was in the past. Actually, it was in the present perfect. Corporate profits, lucros corporativos, have withstood inflação furioso, raging inflation over the last year, but the good times may be ending. So to withstand something is to resist, survive, resistir, suportar, aguentar. Excuse me. We did this one, the same sentence. Raging inflation, corporate profits have withstood, have resisted raging inflation. Inflação furiosa. To boost. To boost. Businesses boosted the prices they charged customers by more than their own costs rose. Boosted would be aumentar, to increase. It could be improve, melhorar. In this case, we're talking about prices. So to boost prices is, I guess, to make them better, but not for the customers. But to aumentar, increase, go up. They're going up, not down, not staying the same. Parlance. Parlance. In the parlance of finance executives, of Faria Lima, right, of finance executives or Wall Street or London, their margins are getting squeezed, and that's acting as a drag on their profits. Parlance would be a noun, nome para jeito geral de falar. So I think we would say linguagem. Linguagem. So in the words of finance executives, well, what are their words? Margins are getting squeezed. Então, apertados. Os margens são ficando mais e mais apertados. And that is acting as a drag on their lucros, on their profits. A drag, impedimento, empecillo, something that is slowing progress, making progress more difficult, not completely stopping, right? Not stopping, but slowing, empecillo. This could be a noun, like in this sentence, a drag, nos lucros, on their profits, or verb, to drag. In the midst. In the midst. S&P, companies in the S&P 500, or S&P 500, são in the midst of reporting overall growth of roughly 2%, of mais ou menos 2%. In the midst is no meio de. No meio de. In the midst. M-I-D-S-T. You could just say in the middle, right? In the midst. Well, why does anyone choose this word and not that word? if they're synonyms. I can't answer that question. But in the middle, or in the middle of reporting, in the midst. To hold the line. Many companies also say they still have the power to hold the line on prices for their products, if not raise them further. To hold the line is to not retreat, to not go back, to not run away. So it's to stay in place, usually when you are facing an attack, uma ameaça, a threat. Manter a linha, resistir, aguentar, right? Um, I believe that's all we got for our vocab. I don't. This is a thick one, right? There's a lot of technical words and expressions that they even mention in the parlance of financing. We're using financial terms, industry specific terms, even though some of them are also used more generally. So if you have any questions or comments, or if I missed, se eu fatei, se eu perdi algumas palavras nos que você está ficando confundindo, leave me a comment. Leave me first inscrever and engajar, communicate. Engorjar? No, engajar, né? Engorja é diferente. In our next segment, we have questions and conversation about inflation and the topic of what it's like, what does it mean, making sense of inflation. Coming up. Question number one. And before I even start, what is the purpose, the intention of this segment? It's for you, someone, anyone who is learning English, specifically or particularly Brazilian, Portuguese speakers who are learning English, who are practicing English, who are maintaining their English, who are being introduced to English, to hear English. It's really that simple. If you're not hearing English, you can study it in a book forever and never, understand the difficulty of having to use your ears to listen to English and then open your mouth to produce English. That is much different than taking a TOEFL exam or a Cambridge FCE or Cambridge Advanced. These are completely different things. And those exams are important for getting jobs in some markets, but in other places and more generally, you have to be able to use English. That means understanding people when they're speaking to you. Not every word, not perfectly, right? You can always say, "Hey, excuse me, I didn't understand. Could you repeat that?" Pode repetir. But you need expor. You need tamanho de amostra grandíssimo. You need a big sample size. So that's the whole point of this podcast. And then I promise you, I'm not making money on this. If I ever do, it's going to be a long time and a little money. But this is purely for my therapy and for you to listen to English words. When you hear or read about inflation, what are some of the first things you think about? Quando você está ouvindo ou lendo sobre inflação, o que são algumas das primeiras coisas que você está pensando? When you hear or read about inflation, what are some of the first things you think about? I think of inflating a balloon. I think about going shopping in the grocery store. I think about, you know what I think about? I think about the things when I'm buying groceries. Sometimes, obviously the things you buy, you notice the difference in price, but also the things you don't buy. The things like in Brazil, there's alcohol usually behind the cashier, a caixa. No, quando você está fazendo compras e você está pagando, atrás das pessoas na caixa tem álcool, né? And I usually don't, I'm not buying those bottles, but you can see the price, change week on week on week. Um, so yeah, I think about gasoline prices because when you're in the city or somewhere in public, it's very obvious to see something like a big giant, advertisement for gas price being very different in an inflationary period. Meat, and then in Brazil, right, beans and rice, which we all love. The price of those things is, you know, sometimes actually frequently depressingly and shockingly higher than what we are accustomed to paying. And I've only been here for 4 years. I imagine some of you, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, what was the price of some of these things? So that's what I think about. What do you think about? Try and explain inflation to me as if I were a 5-year-old. Try and explain inflation to me as if I were a 5-year-old. Tenta, tenta explicar a inflação para mim, como se eu fosse se eu tivesse 5 anos. Let me try. I think the best I can do is explain why inflation happens or what is happening when it's present. Explaining why it happens, clearly I'm not the person to be doing that. But what is the symptoms of inflation? Too much money, cash, uh, which means people are raising their prices because of the the high availability of cash, and that, again, why does that happen? Not the right person, but there could be things like supply chain problems. There could be things like a pandemic, where people had to, rely more on the government for assistance. And also, I don't think people would really like to be mentioning this, but corporate fucking greed. Corporate greed. What's the word for greed in Portuguese? That one's a tough one. Where's the greed? Ambição, avidez, cobiça. Yeah, so I mean, that's how I understand it. When I'm reading about record profits and people losing their jobs or getting paid minimum wage, you have to explain to me how a company can justify paying anyone who's an executive millions of dollars for doing. They're not physically making anything. They're they're certainly not keeping us out of inflation. They're not doing anything besides firing people and keeping pay low. They're not doing magic. It's very basic. So the justification of a executive C-suite paycheck for me being massive and many, 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 many times more than a worker's paycheck, that to me is part of the conversation always. Number three, can you try and explain to me how, and I just mentioned this, can you try and explain to me how in the same economy we can be experiencing both record inflation and record profits? Please. Você pode tentar explicar para mim como no mesmo economia podemos ver ou experienciar os dois, recorde da inflação e recorde dos lucros? I just mentioned my opinion on that in the previous question, so I'm going to say it's greed, ambição, ganancia, of people who don't care about other people. That's where I would immediately go. And governments being completely inept and incapable of doing the right thing. So, our final question. Inflation is always a news topic when it starts to increase. So people on TV start talking about it, on the news, on the internet. Everyone talks about it when it's getting significantly worse. but no one really seems to talk about it between those moments. You know, when we're leading towards inflation, people don't tend to talk about inflation when someone is taking home a massive paycheck and then firing workers. They're not talking about inflation in those moments. They're not explaining their paycheck and how they've earned that money besides having friends who gave them a fancy job. And people on TV seem to have lots of opinions about inflation. So, what's the question? How skeptical are you of the people on TV and in the news who talk about inflation? Do you trust the news to be um, impartial when they're talking about these things? Are they part of the problem? Do they contribute to inflation? Do they contribute to how we are supposed to understand inflation and vote in elections regarding the economy and how people just generally understand what happens in an economy? So in Portuguese, how skeptical, cetical. Quanto cetical você é das pessoas na TV e nas notícias, os que estão falando da inflação? Você confia neles para conhecer, saber a problema e o assunto? Ou você acha que eles também estão contribuindo ao narrativas sobre inflação que tem benefícios para alguns, mas pelo povo não? I think that was okay, but a little bit more. That was a little bit longer than the English version that I did. So, yeah, do you trust the news when they're talking about inflation, or do you think they are just trying to enganar everybody into believing what their private, you know, a news company boardroom or executivos estão tentando criar uma narrativa que vai beneficiar eles, que tem, não sei como se falar, mas falamos em inglês que tem pele no jogo. They have skin in the game, right? These people are not working for free. And they are also people who own news companies are corporate executives who are invested in the economy. So let me know what you think about inflation and the questions that we had. If you have any doubts about the reading, you can find the link in the info section. You can also leave comments, inscrever, subscribe. This is all for you. So if you give me feedback, especially now, I will listen to it and I will directly respond to it because that's part of the fun. So engage, and I hope you enjoyed the episode and the others.